You already know what the last few weeks have felt like. The headlines arrive before you've finished your first cup of coffee. Another study on cognitive decline. Another piece on metabolic collapse in middle age. Another number, 50% of men over 50, 40% of adults under 40, attached to something you did not expect to be attached to yet. You scroll past it. You close the tab, but you felt it land. That landing, that small specific weight that doesn't fully leave, is where this starts. Not with a system, not with a supplement, with the thing you're already carrying when you sit down to watch something like this. There's a photograph on a desk somewhere in the Midwest, printed, not digital, the kind you had to wait a week to hold. The man who found it this morning wasn't looking for it. It was under the electric bill, under a month of mail, under everything that stacks up when you stop noticing certain things. The photograph is 10 years old. He's at a cookout, sunlight hitting his face at an angle that made him look like he had nowhere urgent to be, laughing at something just off frame. He sets down his coffee, not because he looks different, though he does, because he cannot locate the morning it changed. There was no accident, no diagnosis, no single door he walked through, just accumulated distance. 1,000 small elections to wait until tomorrow, until the week cleared, until he felt ready. And then the year was gone, and then another one. And the drift became so gradual that by the time it became visible, it had already become identity. He stands there holding the photograph for maybe 90 seconds, and what moves through him isn't grief, isn't guilt. It's something more precise. It's location. He finally knows exactly where he is. That's the moment most conversations about aging skip entirely. They assume you've already done it. They go straight to the protocol, the stack, the framework, the 5 morning habits. But location is the whole thing. You cannot navigate from a place you haven't admitted you're standing in. And right now, after the kind of years we have just lived through, the cortisol load, the sleep debt, the way the news rewired our nervous systems before we had language for what was happening. A lot of people are standing somewhere they didn't expect to be standing. The word for what this channel is built around is Humanmaxxing. But forget the word for a second. The man in the Midwest doesn't know the word. He just knows that the distance between who he was and who he is was not created by catastrophe. It was created by drift. And drift, this is the part that most longevity content refuses to say plainly. Drift is reversible in ways that are now measurable, documented, and specific to where you are in the arc of your life. Not theoretically reversible, mechanistically reversible. At the level of tissue, at the level of neurotransmitter, at the level of the exact biological processes that accelerate when you've spent a decade under low-grade chronic stress and called it normal. That's what this is going to be about. Not inspiration delivered from a distance. Not the story of someone else's transformation, offered up as proof of what's possible. The actual mechanics, what the research says is happening inside a body at 45, 50, 60 that most people don't know to ask about, and what deliberately interrupts it. The man in the Midwest is still holding the photograph. He sets it down on the desk, face up. He picks up his coffee. It's gone cold. He drinks it anyway. That decision to keep moving from exactly where you are is the only starting point that has ever worked. The question underneath everything you're about to hear is simple. Once the drift becomes the pattern and the pattern becomes identity, is there still a door back? There is. And the answer is going to change how you move through every year you have left. You woke up this morning already carrying something. Not a thought exactly. More like a pressure, low, persistent, sitting somewhere between the chest and the jaw. The kind of thing you don't mention to anyone because there are no good words for it. And also because you've been carrying it long enough that it starts to feel like just the way mornings are now. You made coffee. Maybe you checked the phone before you meant to. And somewhere underneath the routine, that pressure was still there, doing what it does. That feeling has a context. And the context got a name last week. On a Tuesday in late April, the New York Post ran a piece under the headline, "Humanmaxxing is the new wellness trend taking over the internet." The article cited data from a Morning Consult survey, showing that adults over 45 are now the fastest growing demographic in the whole person optimization market, outpacing men in their 20s and 30s by a margin the researchers described as statistically significant and culturally unexpected. The piece quoted 2 longevity physicians, one behavioral economist, and a former Navy SEAL turned recovery coach. It referenced cold plunge protocols, VO2 max testing, relationship audits, sleep tracking, and something called purpose mapping. It was confident. It was slightly breathless. It was the New York Post, so it was also a little louder than the subject required. But it landed, because it named something that had already been moving through a specific generation of men, quietly, without a label, for the better part of 3 years. Humanmaxxing. The simultaneous optimization of every dimension of what it means to be human. Not one supplement, not one metric on a blood work panel your doctor orders, and then doesn't explain. Not a morning routine you perform for 30 days, and then quietly abandon. All of it at once with intention. Body, sleep, mind, relationships, purpose. A coherent effort to bring every layer of yourself into alignment and keep it there. As the years accumulate, as the world outside gets louder, as the pressure that sits in your chest, most mornings keeps asking its question. That's what the word means when you strip the internet off it. Here's what the Post piece understood, even if it said it too fast. The last 4 years did something specific to the American male body over 50 that we haven't fully accounted for yet. The stress was not acute. It wasn't the clean, sharp shock of a single bad event you metabolize and recover from. It was chronic, continuous, the kind that runs at a frequency your nervous system eventually stops flagging as emergency because the system would exhaust itself if it did. So it files it under background noise and keeps going. You can feel what that filing costs if you sit still long enough. The shoulders don't fully drop. The jaw holds something. Sleep comes but doesn't always land right. You wake at 3:17 a.m. with a mind already moving, the room slightly too warm, the ceiling doing nothing useful. The pandemic, then the economic turbulence. the political fracture that deepened instead of healing. The sense, hard to articulate, but almost universally reported by men in their late 40s and 50s, that the institutions they'd trusted to hold the center had quietly stopped being trustworthy, and that no one in authority was going to announce this directly. And running underneath all of it, a continuous current of information designed not to inform but to provoke, because provocation keeps you on the platform, and on the platform is where the money is. The body absorbed all of that. The body always absorbs it. You can track where it went if you know what to look for. The cortisol markers, the sleep architecture, the quality of your attention, the relationships that used to feel like ground and now feel like effort. And at some point, the Morning Consult data puts it somewhere around late 2022, accelerating through 2023. A specific demographic did something the wellness industry hadn't predicted. Men in their 40s, 50s, 60s, the ones the industry had mentally filed under pharmaceuticals and compression recovery, started taking the full optimization conversation seriously. Not the surface version that lives on TikTok and smells like pre-workout powder and involves someone shirtless at 5 a.m. with a ring light. The harder version. The one that asks about sleep architecture, about whether your social connections are pulling you forward or slowly draining something you no longer have in surplus, about whether the work you're doing still carries real meaning, or whether you've been performing the appearance of meaning for so long you've stopped checking. The Humanmaxxing headline caught that current. It named something that was already in motion, what the trend piece didn't have room to say, and what deserves more space than a headline can hold, is that none of this is actually new. Every serious framework for human development that survived long enough to be worth studying understood the body, mind, relationships, and purpose as a single system. Stoic practice, contemplative traditions, East and West, the practical philosophy of men who actually built things, and then wrote down what held and what failed. Every one of them knew. You cannot optimize sleep and neglect meaning and expect the sleep to hold. You cannot build physical strength while living inside chronic relational friction and expect the strength to carry. The systems touch each other. What goes wrong in one layer shows up in the others, usually with a delay that makes the source hard to trace. What's new is not the idea. What's new is the permission and the urgency. Because this generation was told, directly and repeatedly, that this level of intentionality about your own life was something you did in your 20s, before the real obligations arrived. After that, you managed. You maintained. You made reasonable peace with the direction of travel and called it maturity. That story is being refused now, quietly, by men who look at what they are managing and find they are not willing to accept it as the ceiling, which is exactly where three specific frameworks become worth understanding, not as inspiration, but as practical tools that work with the nervous system you actually have, in the body you're actually in, at the age you've actually reached. The first is the mechanics of how attention shapes physical state in real time. The second is how emotional frequency, the baseline you're broadcasting without knowing it, determines what you attract into the life you're trying to build. The third is the emerging science of biological optimization for men over 50. What's actually reversible? What the data says? What it feels like in the body when you stop managing and start building. Those frameworks are the spine of everything that follows. Not because someone said they should be, because they address the pressure you woke up with this morning. Directly, specifically, without asking you to believe anything on faith first. That's where we're going. And we start now. There is a specific weight that arrives not in the headline, but after it. Not when you read the word Humanmaxxing, but a few seconds later, when something quieter moves through you. A recognition, not of the word itself, but of what the word was pointing at. Because you already had the feeling. You just didn't have a name for it. And the moment the New York Post gave it one, something in the chest shifted. The way a knot shifts when you finally press the right place. Not gone, not resolved, just located. The word arrived. And now we have to reckon with what it found. There is a particular kind of quiet that happens in a house after the kids are in bed, or after a long day of things that needed doing and got done. And still, something sitting in the room with you that you can't quite name. Not sadness, not depression, something smaller and more persistent. A low private arithmetic, accounting, not out loud, never out loud. You don't say it at dinner. You don't say it to your spouse. You might not even say it to yourself in clear language. But the math runs anyway in the background. The way a calculation runs in a machine that appears to be off. Decades of it. Particular years. Specific mornings when you meant to start something and didn't. The gym membership that lasted 6 weeks. The diet that worked until it didn't. The version of yourself you had a clear picture of at 40. The one who would have his sleep right by now, his weight right by now, his energy right by now, and the distance between that picture and the mirror. You know this math. You've been doing it for years. And what the word Humanmaxxing did, what the Post did when it named this movement, was not introduce you to a new idea. It reminded you of an old debt, one you'd been quietly carrying. This is not about envy of young people. Let me be clear about that, because it's an easy misread and it sells the feeling short. This is not about watching a 24-year-old in the gym and wishing you were him. That's too simple, and the people watching this are not simple. What this is, what it actually is the specific sensation, physical and located, somewhere between the sternum and the throat, of knowing that a train left and you were not on it. Not because someone blocked you from the platform, not because you were wronged, but because you were busy, or tired, or convinced there would be another one, or because you were doing the things that needed to be done, the job, the family, the rent, the 1,000 legitimate demands of a real life. And by the time you looked up, the schedule had changed. Envy looks outward and finds someone to blame. What you're feeling looks inward and finds something to account for. Those are not the same experience. The second one is harder. The second one is also the only thing that is actually useful. If you have 45 years behind you, or 50, or 60, then you carry a specific kind of weight that younger people are not carrying. Not because you've done more wrong, but because you've done more. Period. More decisions, more years of habits, some chosen, some inherited, some simply accumulated the way sediment accumulates without any single day of choosing it. More versions of yourself that you started and paused. More things you told yourself were temporary, that became permanent without ceremony. The body remembers all of it, not in language, in posture, in the particular way the shoulders sit at the end of a Tuesday, in how long it takes to fall asleep in a quiet room, in the way the energy arrives, or doesn't, on a Monday morning in November when the sky is flat and gray, and nothing on the calendar feels particularly urgent or alive. You lie there for a moment before getting up, not because you're tired exactly, but because something has to be negotiated first. Something has to be convinced. The body keeps the account, even when the mind has moved on. And then something like Humanmaxxing appears, this new cultural word for an old human hunger, and the account opens again, there in the gray November light, before you've even had coffee. I want to stay here for a moment, because this is where most conversations about health and aging make a critical mistake. They move too fast. They see the weight, acknowledge it with a nod, and immediately try to dissolve it with a solution. A protocol, a product, an angle that says, but here is the good news. The good news can wait. Because what is happening right now, this particular sensation of accumulated lateness, is not an obstacle on the way to the transformation. It is the beginning of it. There is a reason physicians studying behavior change have found, again and again, that the people who make lasting changes are not the ones who were inspired. They are the ones who were honest, the ones who let the inventory become real instead of approximate, the ones who said, "This is what I actually weigh. This is what I actually feel when I wake up. This is how long it has actually been." Honesty is not the same as punishment. Honesty is information, and information is the only thing that can be worked with. So let's be honest. If you have been running a deficit in sleep, in movement, in the quality of what you eat or think or feel, that deficit has had years to settle into the body, the way cold settles into an old house. Not dramatically, not all at once, room by room, season by season, until one morning you realize the cold is just how the house feels, and you stop noticing when it changed. The sensation of being behind, of the train already gone, has a texture to it that is easy to mistake for defeat. The shoulders carry it differently than ordinary tiredness. The breath has a particular shallowness to it, not from exertion but from bracing. You carry yourself like someone who has already half decided that a certain chapter is closed and is now trying to make peace with the next one. That posture is not inevitable, but it is real, and it arrived through real experience, through real years of real trade-offs and real losses and real moments when you chose the thing in front of you over the version of yourself you were building toward. Those were not failures in most cases. They were just choices made by someone operating with less information or less time or less capacity than they have now. But the body doesn't distinguish between failure and trade-off. It registers both the same way. as a cost. And the cost, accumulated over decades, is what creates this particular feeling, this specific weight that the word Humanmaxxing located in you before you had finished reading the headline. Here is what I think is important to say plainly before we move anywhere from this. Naming it is not the same as being stuck in it. In fact, naming it is the opposite of being stuck in it. Because you cannot leave a place you have not admitted you're in. The people who never do the honest accounting, who skip over the weight and go directly to the motivation, tend to be the ones who cycle through change without sustaining it. They are running from something they haven't looked at, and you can't get enough distance from a thing you refuse to see. But you, by watching this, by staying in this conversation, you're doing something different. You're letting it be named. That's a different starting position than most people allow themselves. So here is where this chapter ends, with a question rather than a resolution. Because the question is more valuable right now than any answer we could rush toward. We have been treating this sensation as emotional, as a matter of memory and accounting, and years of choices made and unmade. And that framing is real, but it may not be complete. Because what if the feeling of being behind, of time accelerating while the body slows, of mornings that require negotiation before you can stand up? What if that feeling is not only a story assembled from experience, but a signal being generated right now, in actual tissue, in actual chemistry, by something that is still ongoing and therefore still changeable? If that's true, then the question stops being about the past entirely. It becomes a question about the body at this exact moment, and what it's capable of from here. That's the question the next part of this is built around. There is a number that does not appear on any headline. It does not trend. It does not get debated on cable news. No anchor holds it up to the camera with that practiced gravity they reserve for things that feel urgent. And yet it sits inside the body of almost every person watching this, accumulated, patient, compounding quietly the way debt compounds when you stop opening the statements. The number is this: 30 years. You already know the feeling this refers to. It is not dramatic. It is the low-grade awareness that arrives in the quiet after the day is done. The house settling, something cooling on the stove, the particular stillness of a Tuesday night. When you notice, without wanting to, that time has been moving faster than you have. That the version of yourself you kept meaning to become is still somewhere ahead of you, still waiting, and the distance to it does not feel like it's closing. That feeling has a weight, and that weight has a name. It's a biological ledger, accumulated across 30 years of ordinary life, and it is real enough to be read clearly. So let's read it. Start with sleep, because sleep is where most people take their first significant loss without registering the cost. Research out of the University of Chicago documented what happens to muscle protein synthesis when sleep is chronically restricted, not eliminated, not disordered in some clinical extreme, but simply cut short by 1 to 2 hours a night over years. The body reduces the rate at which it builds and repairs muscle tissue, not dramatically, incrementally, a fraction of a percent per cycle, invisible across any single year. But run that fraction across a decade, and the ledger entry becomes legible. Reduced lean muscle mass, lower resting metabolic rate, altered glucose regulation, and mitochondrial function measurably compromised compared to a cohort that slept the same years at full duration. Mitochondria matter here in ways most people don't feel until the evidence is already years old. When their function degrades, recovery slows in ways that are quiet but unmistakable. The muscle soreness that used to clear in 24 hours now lingers into the third day. The cold that once broke in 3 days now drags through a week. The morning fog that should lift by 8 o'clock is still there at 10, thick and faintly chemical, like a room that hasn't been opened in too long. These are not random annoyances. They are the accumulated record of inadequate restoration, filed patiently in tissue, waiting to be noticed. Now add the relational layer, because the body does not experience isolation as an abstraction. A meta-analysis covering data from 148 independent studies, tracking over 8,000 adults across more than 2 decades, found that social isolation and loneliness increase all-cause mortality risk by approximately 26 to 29%. Not through one mechanism, but through several operating simultaneously. Elevated inflammatory markers, disrupted circadian rhythm, increased cortisol baseline. And this is the one that tends to surprise people: measurably accelerated muscle loss in men over 50. The social deprivation signal and the physical deterioration signal are not separate events in the body. They overlap. They amplify each other. The body treats prolonged relational thinness the same way it treats a low-grade physical threat. It tightens, it conserves, it prepares. And that preparation, maintained across years rather than hours, costs tissue, costs density, costs the cognitive clarity that depends on a nervous system that is not perpetually organizing itself around an ambient signal of danger. This is not about being lonely in the way the word is usually used. Most people watching this have people in their lives, voices in the kitchen, names in the phone, evenings that are technically shared. The question is a different one. When is the last time a conversation left you feeling restored rather than simply managed? The research does not measure the presence of other humans. It measures the quality of felt connection. Those are not the same instrument. Then there is the purpose layer. And this is where the data becomes uncomfortable in a particular way. Work out of Tohoku University in Japan, tracking over 43,000 adults across a 7-year follow-up period, found that individuals who reported a clear sense of ikigai, a reason to get up, a felt direction pulling them forward, showed significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease, lower inflammatory markers, and higher physical function scores compared to those who reported ambiguity or absence of purpose. The effect size was not small. It was comparable in magnitude to the cardiovascular protection associated with regular physical exercise. Apply the 30-year frame to that finding. If the deferral of purpose, the project kept waiting, the version of yourself kept pending, operates biologically with a force comparable to physical inactivity, then the decades a person spent living competently, but without felt direction were not neutral years. They were a cost the body quietly absorbed and filed. The cognitive dimension compounds this. A study from Rush University Medical Center, tracking more than 900 older adults, found that purposeful engagement was one of the strongest predictors of preserved cognitive function in aging. Not education level, not income, not even physical exercise in isolation. Purpose. The felt sense that there is a direction to the day, that the arc of time has a shape you are participating in rather than simply enduring. When that signal is absent or muted or deferred, the cognitive aging curve steepens. The architecture associated with executive function, with working memory, with the ability to hold complexity and navigate it. That architecture, like muscle, requires use to maintain density, and the use it requires is not abstract. It is specific. It is the kind of engagement that comes from caring about an outcome, from being pulled forward by something rather than simply pushed through the days by habit and obligation. The 30 years that built this inventory were not years of failure. They were years of life as it actually operates, genuinely pressured, legitimately demanding, weighted with responsibilities that arrived before the wisdom to carry them gracefully. Nobody chose the sleep debt the way they might choose a bad investment. The relationships didn't thin on purpose. The purpose didn't recede because anyone decided it should. These things happen the way erosion happens, not with a single event but with water and time, and the absence of intervention. That last phrase is the one that matters now. The absence of intervention. Because what the research is doing, calmly, without drama, with the patience of data gathered across decades and replicated across independent populations, is establishing something that changes how this entire inventory is read. The cost is measurable. Mitochondrial function, measurable. Muscle protein synthesis rates, measurable. Inflammatory marker profiles, measurable. Cognitive reserve, measurable. The biological age of tissue relative to chronological age, measurable, and in most of these studies, divergent from chronological age by a margin that reflects accumulated experience rather than fixed destiny. And here is the turn that the data keeps making, quietly, in the conclusions of studies that rarely generate headlines. Measurable means responsive. The same instruments that documented the cost also documented what happened when conditions change. Mitochondrial function, improving within weeks of altered recovery patterns. Lean mass responding to resistant stimulus in adults well into their 60s and 70s. Inflammatory profiles shifting with changes in the relational and purposive environment. Cognitive reserve, not recovering in some magical restoration, but stabilizing, and in some studies improving, in adults who re-engaged with directed, meaningful work after years of its absence. The body kept the ledger. The body also kept the capacity for revision, which means the question that has been forming through everything in this chapter, the one now standing at the edge of what you've just absorbed, is not whether reversal is possible. The data settled that. The question is what the reversal curve actually looks like, not in theory, not in the vocabulary of wellness marketing, but in real biological time, with real mechanisms, operating in a body at the exact age you are right now. How long? How much? By what specific path? That answer exists in the data too. It is more precise than most people expect, and more reachable than the 30-year ledger might suggest from the inside. There is a number that showed up in an earlier chapter, and it has probably stayed with you. Not the number itself, the feeling of it. The weight of a calculation you didn't ask for, but couldn't put down once it was handed to you. The inventory of decades, the choices that compounded quietly, the years that ran on a kind of biological autopilot while you were busy living. The account exists. It is measurable. And somewhere between that chapter and this one, you may have felt something shift, not the comfortable kind of shift, but the kind that rearranges the furniture of a room you thought you knew. That shift is exactly where this chapter begins. There is a voice, not the one that motivates, not the one that criticizes in the broad, familiar way, the one that says you ate badly, or skipped the walk, or spent too long on the couch. That voice most people have learned to argue with. It's blunt. It's recognizable. You can push back on it. This one is different. This voice is quieter, more precise. It arrives not when you're failing at something, but when you're about to begin. When the thought first surfaces, a new direction, a new practice, a different way of moving through your days. And before it can fully form, before it can gather any real weight, it's already there, already past the point. Too late for this. That kind of thing, that's for people who started earlier. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It speaks with the calm authority of someone who has reviewed the file and reached a conclusion. And because it arrives so early in the thought, before you've had time to evaluate it, it often feels less like an opinion and more like a fact. Imagine a person, call him David, 56, who wakes one morning with the particular stillness that precedes a decision. The light is coming in flat and gray. The coffee is going cold on the nightstand. He's been reading about cold water immersion, about the evidence around mitochondrial density and vascular adaptation, and something in him wants to try it, wants it the way you want something you haven't let yourself want in a while. And then the thought arrives, uninvited, reasonable as a weather forecast. You're not the demographic for this. He puts the article down, gets up, makes fresh coffee, moves on. What happened in that moment was not weakness. It was not pessimism. It was a biological system, executing a calculation and delivering the result in the form of a feeling. The brain, which consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy, while representing about 2% of its mass, is ruthlessly efficient about protecting that budget. It does not like open processes. It does not like the metabolic cost of rehearsing new behaviors, building new neural pathways, recalibrating systems that have reached a working equilibrium. Change is expensive, not emotionally expensive, biologically expensive, and the brain, left to its own optimization logic, will almost always choose the cheaper path. The cost of beginning something new at this point, the system decides, is higher than the likely return. Then it dresses that conclusion in language and sends it up. Researchers studying what they called fixed versus open aging trajectories, the degree to which a person's beliefs about their own biological future had calcified into settled expectation, found something that was difficult to explain away. Participants who were certain their window for significant physical adaptation had closed showed measurable differences in inflammatory markers, in stress axis reactivity, in the pace of cellular aging, compared to participants of identical chronological age who held what the researchers called open trajectory beliefs. The participants with fixed beliefs did not feel pessimistic. That's the part worth sitting with. They felt realistic. They described themselves as having a clear-eyed relationship with their own biology. They used words like pragmatic, mature, honest. They weren't defeated. They were simply certain. And that certainty, precise, calm, well-reasoned, was aging them faster than the calendar was. A separate study tracked adults over 50 across 6 years, measuring not just their health behaviors, but their beliefs about whether meaningful change remained available to them. The finding was uncomfortable in its clarity. The belief that the door was still open, not that change was easy, not that it was guaranteed, but simply that it had not yet been foreclosed, predicted actual health outcomes more powerfully than the health behaviors themselves, not instead of walking or eating well or sleeping, prior to them and upstream of them, which means the voice is not merely discouragement. You can push through on a motivated morning. It creates the biological condition it claims to observe. It closes the door it presents itself as simply reporting on. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett describes the brain as a prediction machine, not a reaction machine. It doesn't wait for input and then respond. It predicts constantly what the incoming signal will be and adjusts based on the difference between prediction and reality. Think about what that means for David, putting down his article. The brain has built a model. The model was assembled from decades of incoming signal. A doctor's careful pragmatism at a routine physical. The specific way magazines stop featuring people who look like him in certain contexts. A body that has been telling him certain things for long enough that he began to mistake current conditions for permanent facts. The model says, at this stage, significant biological adaptation does not occur. When David reaches towards something new, the brain runs the prediction, checks the model, finds a mismatch and flags it as unlikely. The flag arrives as a voice. The voice is not running on malice. It is running on old data, on a model built when the inputs were different, from sources that had their own limitations and blind spots. The hardware has changed more than the software knows. There is a particular texture to the moment it arrives. You may recognize it now. It comes in the morning sometimes, in that gray pre-coffee quiet before the day asserts itself, when there is just enough space for something new to take a tentative shape. The room is cold. The sheets are still warm. The thought surfaces, something you read, something someone mentioned, a direction you haven't tried, and then, almost gently, you know how this goes. The math doesn't work in your favor anymore. It comes in conversation too. Someone younger mentions something they've started, and something in you reaches toward it, and the voice intercepts that reach before it completes. That's for them. They have more runway. What makes it so difficult to challenge is that it sounds like experience. It sounds like someone who has been watching you carefully for a long time and knows things a motivated moment doesn't. It sounds, in other words, like wisdom. But wisdom and calcification look nearly identical from the inside. The brain's protective mechanism, its attempt to spare you the cost of change, arrives dressed in the clothes of hard-won knowledge. And because you have genuinely earned hard-won knowledge over these decades, you are predisposed to trust it. The studies on fixed versus open trajectory beliefs did not find that people with open beliefs had easier histories, more resources, more reasons for optimism. In many cases, the reverse was true. People who had faced genuine hardship, real loss, significant setbacks, and who still operated with the biological posture of an open door, showed more resilience at the cellular level, not less. It was not their circumstances that kept the door open. It was something prior to circumstances, something about how they held the question of what remained possible, not with confident declarations, but with what one researcher called enrolled uncertainty, a willingness to not yet know, to keep the verdict pending one more day. The voice says the verdict is in. The verdict is not in. And this is where the chapter leaves you, because what comes next needs its own space. If the voice is a biological mechanism, a predictive system running a model built from specific inputs over a specific period of time, then it has a traceable history. It was assembled from something. The inputs have sources, and the sources have names. And some of those names are institutions, and some are people, and some are a single conversation in a doctor's office that lasted 4 minutes and lodged somewhere it was never meant to stay. Where does the voice come from? Not philosophically, neurologically, biographically. That question has an answer, and the answer is considerably more useful and more uncomfortable than simply deciding the voice is wrong and pushing past it on a good day, because some of what the voice knows is real. The question worth moving toward is which parts.
There is a moment, not a metaphor, an actual physical moment, when the body decides something before the mind does. You've been in that moment. You just may not have named it precisely. A test result comes back. A birthday passes. You catch yourself in a mirror not vanishing. That's not the word, but recalculating. And somewhere below the level of language, something in you draws a quiet line, a kind of internal verdict that nobody says out loud, but almost everyone past a certain age has handed down upon themselves. The voice doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It just says, this is probably how it goes now. Earlier in this video, we named that voice. We said it was running a program. We said it had a face, a mechanism, a neural architecture that was built, not inherited, not fated, built by repetition and reinforcement in years of receiving the world in a particular way. Now we go further. But first, stay here for a moment. Don't move past it yet, because that voice, the one that says this is probably how it goes now, it doesn't arrive as an intruder. It arrives as a conclusion. It feels like the reasonable thing a reasonable person eventually understands about themselves. It arrives on a Tuesday in ordinary light, maybe after climbing a flight of stairs and noticing the effort, or after sitting down at a desk and realizing how long it took to get comfortable. It doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like honesty, like finally stopping the performance of believing otherwise. That is the specific thing worth sitting with. Not the voice as metaphor, the voice as physical experience, the tightness in the chest that precedes it, the low background hum of it, not loud enough to address, not quiet enough to ignore. The way it shapes what you reach for in the morning, the way it quietly edits what you're willing to try. The exhaustion isn't laziness. It's the cost of carrying a forecast you've already accepted. And here's what makes that so difficult to argue with from the inside. The forecast is based on real data. Your data, years of it. The body knows what it has been given. It knows the sleep it has received, the food it has processed, the stress it has absorbed without adequate outlet. The long stretches of low demand followed by bursts of effort that didn't land the way they used to. The voice isn't making things up. It is running a model, a reasonable, internally consistent, statistically grounded model built from everything that has actually happened in your particular life. The problem, and this is not reassurance, this is structural, is that the model is only modeling one scenario. It is modeling continuation, more of what has been. It is not modeling what happens when the input changes. Here's how you see that clearly. Take a man in his early 60s. Not athletic, not broken, just ordinary, the word he would use himself. A desk, a commute, a body he has mostly been diplomatic with rather than attentive to. Not dramatic decline, functional, but with that low hum underneath, that background sense that the better part of the physical story is behind him. He has received that sense from the world around him, from the way medicine talks to him now, from the way clothing is cut, from the way conversations about health in his age group are mostly about management, not growth, about slowing, not reversing, about being sensible. He starts something, doesn't matter what exactly, something that places progressive demand on the body consistently, over time, not aggressively, not with the ambition of 30, just consistently, with enough resistance to require genuine adaptation. 6 months in, something has changed that he did not expect. Not the number on the scale, not some transformation video result, something quieter. The stairs are different. The chair is different. The mirror is not offering the same information it was. And somewhere underneath all of it, a forecast that felt like fact is now sitting less comfortably in its frame. What happened to him is not a mystery. The tissue responded. The signal arrived, and the body, which had not been asked that question in years, answered. This is not rare. This is not the result of exceptional genetics or unusual discipline or some intervention available only to the motivated few. This is what the research across multiple decades and multiple populations keeps showing in numbers that can be checked, in results that replicate. The body does not stop listening. It goes quiet when nothing is speaking to it. That is not the same thing. And the brain follows the same logic. Cognitive function, the part that feels most irreversible, most frightening in the quiet of an honest moment, operates on the same principle. Not infinitely, not without real limits, but the assumption that the door closes at a certain age, that whatever has declined is now simply the permanent condition, is not what the longitudinal data shows. The brain reorganizes in response to input. New input, genuine demand, is slower than it was. It costs more, but it moves. The system did not close. It waited, which means the voice, the reasonable, data-grounded, internally consistent voice that says, "This is probably how it goes now," is working from an incomplete file. It has the history. It is missing the variable. The moment the variable changes, the model is wrong. Sit with that without rushing to find it motivating. It is not meant to be motivating. It is meant to be accurate. There is a difference, and the difference matters, because motivation fades with the morning and accuracy stays. The problem was not biological capacity. That was present. That was, in some important sense, waiting. What was absent was the signal. And what kept the signal absent was a forecast so thoroughly absorbed that it stopped feeling like a forecast and started feeling like identity. The body was not finished. The story told about the body became the evidence that it was. That is the specific thing this chapter is asking you to hold. Not as comfort, as information. Because if the capacity was always there, if the tissue still listens, if the brain still reorganizes, if the line was never as fixed as the voice insisted, then the question changes completely. It is no longer a question about biology. It becomes a question about what actually stood between a person and the adaptation that was always possible. What held the signal back? What kept a reasonable person running a model built on incomplete information without ever receiving the missing variable? That question has a specific answer, not an abstract one, not a motivational one, and it does not live in the muscle. You already know the feeling, not the name for it, the feeling itself. The one that lives somewhere between your sternum and your throat on a Tuesday morning when nothing is technically wrong. Low grade, persistent, like a frequency you can't tune out and can't quite locate. If you felt it, you don't need me to describe it further. You just felt it again. That feeling is where this chapter actually begins. Because before I tell you what the science found, I need you to know that it found it by following people who felt exactly that. Not sick people, not oppressed people, people who were, by every measurable standard, doing the work, and still waking up into that hum. For decades, the prevailing assumption inside longevity research was that the body past a certain age simply stopped cooperating, that the ceiling was fixed, chromosomal, written into the marrow, a function of hardware degrading in a direction that couldn't be reversed. The work was about slowing the slide, managing the loss. The biology, the field agreed, was the barrier. That assumption has now been quietly dismantled, study by study, cohort by cohort. The data accumulated until the weight of it became impossible to hold up against the old story. The reversal is possible, not someday now, in measurable tissue, in documented cellular response, in people who had already been written off by the standard model. The ceiling was never in the biology, not a motivational claim. That is what the longitudinal record shows. So, if the biology was never the barrier, what was? His name doesn't matter. He's 49. He wakes each morning to a bedroom that's 68 degrees because he read the research on sleep temperature and adjusted accordingly. The blackout curtains seal the room to full dark. Before bed, magnesium glycinate, water, the specific quiet he has engineered to signal his nervous system towards sleep. He lifts 4 days a week. Progressive overload tracked in a worn notebook he keeps on the shelf above his gym bag. His HRV scores are good. Resting heart rate, 51. His pill organizer on the kitchen counter holds creatine, vitamin D, omega-3s. He takes them with breakfast beside a window because he also read about morning light. He is not tired because he's lazy. He is not tired because he's doing it wrong. He is tired in a way that the sleep doesn't touch. A heaviness that's still there at 9 in the morning after 8 full hours. Not depression, not illness. Something more like the sensation of wearing a coat indoors that you keep forgetting to take off. A low, continuous weight. He adjusts the training split. He adds red light therapy to the evening routine, stands in its dim red warmth for 20 minutes feeling slightly ridiculous and then slightly hopeful, and then, weeks later, about the same as before. He tries breath work at a wooden desk in the early dark, his exhales fogging slightly in the cold of a window cracked open the way the protocol specified. The metrics hold. The feeling doesn't move. He is not unique. Versions of him walk into functional medicine practices every week. Versions of him have written to this channel. And what is happening to him is not a gap in his protocol. What is happening to him is this. He is optimizing from a posture deficit. Every intervention he runs begins from the same unspoken premise, that he is broken and the protocol will fix him, that he is behind and the supplementation will close the gap, that his body is a problem requiring management rather than a system awaiting direction. The science behind what he's doing is solid. The protocols are real. But the internal posture from which every intervention departs is one of fundamental lack. And that posture is not neutral. It has a biochemistry. Here is what the stress physiology research tells us. And I want to be specific because this is where the conversation usually softens into abstraction, and it shouldn't. When a person operates from chronic low-grade threat, and the belief that you are insufficient, that you are behind, that your body is quietly failing you, registers in the threat detection architecture of the brain as exactly that. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis maintains a particular baseline activation. Not full alarm, not crisis, a sustained readiness. A system perpetually braced, the way a jaw clenches in a meeting and the person holding it stopped noticing 3 hours ago. In that state, the same interventions produce different results than they would in a system operating from calm. Sheldon Cohen's lab at Carnegie Mellon has been running this thread for 30 years. A 2012 study measured immune response in subjects exposed to a rhinovirus after being grouped by dominant psychological orientation. Deficit-focused versus what the researchers called positive effect. Same exposure, same viral load. The deficit-oriented group showed measurably different inflammatory responses, not because their bodies were weaker, because their systems were already in a particular gear. Bracing costs something. It draws continuously from every process running in the background. The way a phone that's searching for signal all night drains its battery by morning without ever having made a call. Now, put that 49-year-old man back in his 68-degree bedroom. He is pouring real investment into a system that is simultaneously diverting resources toward the management of a perceived threat. The sleep works. The creatine works. The lifting absolutely works. But they're working into a headwind he cannot see because it isn't external. It is positional. It is the angle from which he approaches his own body every morning before he's said a word to anyone. The optimization industry does not tell you this. Not out of conspiracy, out of structure. The industry sells sequences. Protocol before state. Intervention before orientation. That sequencing makes sense commercially. A supplement fits in a bottle. An internal posture does not. You can engineer a sleep system. You cannot engineer the quality of intention someone carries into it. So the architecture of the industry, not maliciously but inevitably, places the protocol first and assumes the internal state will follow. Fix the inputs, fix the output. The data does not support that sequence. A 2020 paper in Psychosomatic Medicine tracked two groups through an identical 12-week exercise intervention. Same exercises, same frequency, same duration. Participants who entered with approach motivation, moving towards something, showed significantly greater improvements in inflammatory markers and mitochondrial efficiency than participants with identical fitness profiles who entered with avoidance motivation, running from something. The variable was not what they did. It was what they believed they were doing it for. And that difference showed up not in how people reported feeling. It showed up in the tissue, in the blood, in the mitochondria themselves. The man with the perfect protocol is not doing anything wrong. The magnesium is good. The lifting is genuinely important. The sleep science is real. None of that is the problem. The problem is the unexamined belief embedded in the very act of optimization, the one that says, I am not enough yet, and these interventions are the evidence. That belief is the headwind. Measurable not metaphorically, biologically, in inflammatory markers and mitochondrial efficiency and the slope of the very numbers he is tracking. It runs in the background of every result he gets and shapes what those results can become. Optimization from deficit is real optimization. It produces results, but it moves the way a man running from something moves, fast and hard and effective and exhausting in a way that never fully resolves, the tightness never quite leaving the chest, the shoulders never quite dropping. Optimization from decision, from a starting place that already assumes sufficiency, that approaches the protocol not as repair, but as expansion, that moves differently. It accumulates differently. It compounds differently. The body responds to it differently because the body is not receiving the same signal, even when every external input is identical. That is what the research has been quietly showing for 3 decades, in journals without product sponsors, in findings that don't get bottled and therefore don't get marketed, in a body of work that has been building patiently toward a conclusion the industry has no financial reason to hand you. Which leaves the only question that actually matters now. What does the shift look like from the inside? Not as a principle, as a texture. What does a person feel in their chest, and their hands, and the first 30 seconds of a morning when they're operating from decision rather than deficit? How do you know which one you're in? And how does the move between them actually happen? Not as an idea, but as something that changes the temperature of the next 24 hours. That is where the next part of this begins. And you're closer to the answer than you've probably been told to expect. You already know the feeling. You probably had it this week. That low hum of something wrong. Not panic, not crisis, just the persistent, low-grade pressure of a world that keeps producing information you don't know what to do with. Chest slightly tight. Tired in a way sleep hasn't been fixing. Some part of you braced, though you couldn't say precisely for what. That feeling is the subject of this chapter. not metaphorically, physiologically. But before we get there, something happened this week that makes this concrete in a way I want you to hold on to. The American Heart Association published updated findings from a longitudinal study tracking adults over 50 through structured lifestyle interventions. The headline numbers: blood pressure reduction, metabolic markers, body composition, were largely what you'd expect. But buried in the methodology was something the press coverage mostly skipped. The researchers had tracked participants' self-reported internal state at the point of initiation. What were they feeling when they started? And those internal readings predicted 12-month outcomes more reliably than the specific protocol participants followed, more reliably than what they ate, more reliably than how much they moved. The ground they started from mattered more than the steps they took. That finding didn't make the wellness roundups. It should have led them. Let me make this felt rather than argued. Two men, both 53, both sitting in the same waiting room. You know, the kind, fluorescent lights that make everyone look slightly wrong. Chairs bolted together in rows. The smell of industrial cleaner and old coffee. Both have just been told by their doctors that their blood pressure is climbing, their weight has shifted in the wrong direction, and it would be strongly advisable to change how they eat and move. Same words, roughly. Same slight catch in the doctor's voice that lands harder than the clinical language around it. The first man drives home, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. He is not panicking. It's quieter than panic. It's the cold, factual certainty that he is losing ground he may not get back. That time is shortening, that his body is beginning to work against him, that if he doesn't fix this now, what comes next will be worse. He goes home and starts. He downloads an app. He clears the pantry. He starts running before dawn in the dark, teeth gritted, driven. He is disciplined. He is motivated. And he is, in a way he can't fully name, bracing, body tight, jaw set, chest carrying something he can't put down. The second man drives home and feels something different. Not optimism. Not the bright manufactured cheerfulness of an advertisement. Something older and quieter. A sense that his body has been carrying him for 53 years and still showed up this morning. That the conversation with his doctor was not a verdict, but a coordinate. Here is where you are. Here is the direction worth walking. He makes the same changes. Same foods, roughly. Same movement. Same sleep hours targeted. But his jaw isn't clenched when he starts. His shoulders aren't up near his ears. Same waiting room. Same diagnosis. Same protocol. Different ground. Here is what the research found, and I want the specificity to land the way it should. Work coming out of the University of Rochester, grounded in self-determination theory, separated participants by what researchers called motivational quality at initiation. Not how motivated they were, how they were motivated. Those starting from autonomous motivation, change that felt chosen, internally coherent, rooted in a sense of personal value rather than incoming threat, showed meaningfully better adherence at 12 months. Measurably different sleep architecture at 6 months. Significantly lower cortisol profiles throughout. The cortisol piece is where this stops being psychology and becomes biology. When you begin a change program with cortisol elevated, not spiked, not acutely stressed, just chronically primed the way a braced body stays primed. Your physiology allocates resources as if the threat is ongoing. Repair cycles compress. The anabolic response to exercise blunts. During sleep, the proportion of slow-wave depth decreases because the autonomic system stays partially vigilant, one ear always open, waiting. The glymphatic clearing your brain runs in deep sleep gets shortened. The growth hormone pulse, that muscle protein synthesis depends on, gets reduced. Not canceled, reduced. You can feel this if you've lived it. You work hard for 6 months, and the results are real, but somehow less than they should be. You're tired in the specific way of someone who paid the full price and received partial goods, which then feeds the fear, which keeps the cortisol up, which compresses the sleep further. The researchers called this a self-reinforcing cycle, not a trap. They were deliberate about that distinction. A cycle has an entry point that can be changed. Separate work from HeartMath Institute and researchers at Maastricht University has been mapping heart rate variability not just as an output, the score on your wearable, the recovery metric, but as a signal the body uses to make forward decisions about resource allocation. When HRV runs consistently low, as it does in people operating from scarcity or low-grade urgency, the body's predictive systems read this as evidence that the environment is dangerous. And a body that has concluded on a cellular level that the environment is dangerous does not invest in long construction projects. It keeps the standing army mobilized. It holds inflammation slightly elevated. It runs the short maintenance cycles, not the deep ones. You can feel the difference in your skin, in your joints, in the specific quality of your fatigue. Not the clean tiredness of exertion, but the gritty, unrefreshed exhaustion of a system that never fully powered down. A body receiving the physiological signal that it is safe does the opposite. It runs the longer cycles. It invests in repair. It responds more robustly to the same exercise stimulus. It ages as the researchers measured it, more slowly at the cellular level. Not because it is doing different things, but because it is receiving different permission. The state is not decoration. It is the operating condition under which everything else either compounds or leaks away. The second man, the one who left the waiting room without his jaw clenched, was not calm because his news was good. His news was the same. He was operating from a different internal register that produced a different biochemical environment before he changed a single behavior. Different cortisol baseline, different HRV signature, different sleep profile, a different cellular environment into which every subsequent correct choice would land and either take root or not. That difference is what the whole architecture of health information delivery misses. The article, the protocol list, the morning routine, the supplement stack, all of it is built on the assumption that the right sequence is information first, state shift second. Learn what to do, then feel better about doing it. But the physiology runs the other direction. The state shapes the soil. The protocol is what you plant in it. Plant the same seed in compacted, cortisol-flooded ground and in ground that is open and rested and receiving, and you do not get the same harvest. This is not a soft observation. It is measurable, and it has been measured. So here's where this chapter lands you. And I mean lands, not suspends, not teases, but actually leaves you standing somewhere solid. You do not have to feel wonderful to begin. The second man did not feel wonderful. He felt the weight of that waiting room, the fluorescent hum, the doctor's careful voice. But he left with his body still on his side, rather than turned against him in his own mind. That is the distinction. Not optimism, not denial. The specific, grounded recognition that you are still here, still capable of response, still worth the investment of your own attention. That recognition is not a feeling you wait to arrive. It is a condition you can move toward deliberately. And the next chapter is about exactly that. What that movement looks like from the inside, in your body, on a Tuesday morning, before the protocol asks anything of you at all. The ground comes first. Now you know why. What to do with that knowledge is where we go next. There's a moment, not dramatic, not loud, when something clicks. Not an idea, not a decision, something in the body itself. You've been doing the thing you were told to do. The breathing exercise, the early morning walk, the lighter dinner. And for weeks, maybe months, it felt like discipline, like work, like one more item on a list you were never quite keeping up with. You did it the way you pay a bill, correctly, without pleasure, because the cost of not doing it seemed higher. And then, one morning, without announcement, without any change in the routine itself, you did it differently. The door handle was cold. That specific cold of early air that hasn't been touched by the day yet. You stepped outside and the light came in low and flat across the pavement. The kind of light that doesn't ask anything of you. And there was a smell you couldn't name, something between wet concrete and cut grass and the particular emptiness of a street before traffic starts. You stood in it. You didn't check the time. You turned your face toward the light, and something in you leaned into it. Not because you'd read that morning sunlight calibrates your circadian rhythm. Not because some voice in a video told you to, but because your body asked for it. Because the light felt like something you were owed, and you knew, without explaining it to yourself, that receiving it fully was not indulgence. It was accuracy. Here is what nobody says clearly enough. The practices of biohacking, the breathing, the fasting, the light exposure, the movement, these are not the intervention. They are not the medicine you take to fix the problem. They are what happens after. They are what the body starts speaking when the internal weather changes. They are not the cause of the transformation. They are the language transformation uses to make itself visible. And the difference is not philosophical. It is not a matter of framing or attitude or motivation. The difference is physiological. It runs through your autonomic nervous system, your vagal tone, your inflammatory signaling, your hormonal cascades. And once you understand what is actually happening inside you when you move from obligation to resonance, the whole architecture of health optimization reorganizes itself around a different center. Let's go there. When your internal state is one of threat, chronic, low-grade, ambient threat, your nervous system governs accordingly. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes conflict and regulates attention, stays hot. Your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis holds a slightly elevated baseline output, not crisis levels, not the spike that comes from an immediate danger, just the slow, continuous hum of a system that has decided, based on accumulated evidence, that the world requires vigilance. In that state, you can still do the breathing exercise. You can still fast. You can still walk. But your body receives those practices differently than it would if your baseline state were one of safety. The work of Stephen Porges on polyvagal theory, developed over 4 decades of rigorous clinical and physiological study, establishes something that sounds counterintuitive until you feel its truth. The biological capacity to heal, repair, and integrate depends on whether the nervous system has genuinely down-regulated from a defensive posture, not calmed down on the surface, not cognitively convinced, down-regulated at the level of the brainstem's dorsal and ventral vagal circuits. When you fast from a place of fear of aging, fear of losing the body, fear of what the mirror is saying, the physiological experience of that fast is not the same as fasting from a place of sufficiency. The hormetic stress of caloric restriction, which is real and documented, is processed differently by a system in defensive mode than by a system in what Porges calls the social engagement state, the biological signature of safety. Same input, different system reading it, different result. This holds at the molecular level. The sirtuin proteins, SRT1 in particular, associated with cellular stress resistance and longevity signaling, show attenuated upregulation when the system is running in low-grade threat mode, even when the fasting protocol itself is identical. The variable is not the fast. The variable is the state from which the fast is undertaken. Researchers working at the intersection of psychoneuroimmunology and behavioral medicine have been documenting this pattern consistently enough that it no longer reads as a hypothesis. It reads as a mechanism. Same fast, different body, different result, because the body is not a machine that processes inputs mechanically. It is a living system that interprets inputs through the lens of its current state. And the current state is the variable that most biohacking frameworks quietly skip over. Not because the science isn't there, but because it's harder to sell. You can sell protocol. You can list the steps. You cannot easily package a shift in inner state as a product with a barcode and a shipping address. So the industry gives you the protocol and asks you to trust that if you do the steps correctly, the results will follow. And sometimes they do. Sometimes the protocol itself, followed consistently enough, produces enough physiological change to begin shifting the inner state. The body leads and the mind follows. That path is real, but there is another path, one that moves in the opposite direction, one where the inner state shifts first, through accumulated experience, through a single conversation, through a piece of music at the right moment, through the kind of silence that comes after a long exhale, and the body, reading that shift, begins generating its own appetite for the practices that sustain it. This is the path that researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences have been mapping for the better part of a decade. Their work on interoception, the brain's reading of its own body's internal signals, shows that individuals with higher interoceptive accuracy, meaning those who can more precisely sense what the body is doing from the inside, not only make different behavioral choices, but make them earlier with less deliberation, with less internal conflict. They don't decide to breathe deeply. Something in them breathes deeply, and they notice it was already happening. They don't schedule the morning walk. The body signals readiness for it before the mind has formulated the plan. Interoception is trainable. It improves with age when cultivated, which is one of the genuinely encouraging findings in the cognitive neuroscience of midlife. The noise of younger years, the social performance, the career anxiety, the relentless forward momentum, quiets enough for a person in their mid-40s and beyond to hear signals that were always there, transmitting unattended. Getting older, when it goes well, means getting louder on the inside. Not noisier, louder in the sense of clearer. The signal-to-noise ratio shifts in your favor if you let it. And when that capacity opens, when you genuinely begin to hear what the body is asking for, something changes in how the practices land. Intermittent fasting stops being a deprivation schedule and becomes a felt sense of when eating is actually needed versus when it's habitual. Morning sunlight stops being a bullet point in someone else's protocol and becomes a pull, a gravitational lean towards something the body recognizes as nourishment. Movement stops being exercise in the punitive sense, the burning away of excess, the managing of decay, and becomes something closer to conversation. The body speaking in motion, you listening in sweat. The practices don't disappear. They become more precise, more personalized, more sustainable in the way that only things we actually want are sustainable. Because what long-term behavioral research confirms repeatedly across disciplines, across populations, we do not sustain what we impose on ourselves from a place of fear. We sustain what we choose from a place of sufficiency, not abundance, not happiness. Sufficiency, the felt sense that the current moment contains what is needed to take the next step. A person operating from sufficiency, fasting twice a week, doing 20 minutes of zone 2 movement 3 mornings a week, going outside without sunglasses for the first 10 minutes of the day. That person is receiving more from those practices at the cellular level than someone with a more aggressive protocol driven by the quiet terror of watching the body age. This is the reposition. Biohacking is not a list of things you do to become better. It is the set of practices that emerge naturally when the internal state changes. The protocol is real. The science is real. The breathing and the light and the fasting and the movement, all of it produces measurable biological benefit. But the magnitude of that benefit and the sustainability of the behaviors that generate it depend almost entirely on the state from which they are initiated. And the state, that is the work that no supplement company, no longevity clinic, no morning routine checklist will ever address, because they cannot package it and they cannot take credit for it. Only you can do that work. And the territory where it happens is not a gym or a fasting window or a cold shower. It is right here, the place you were already standing before you started reading the next protocol. Which brings us to a question that has been circling this entire conversation, one that deserves more than a quick answer. Because everything we've been discussing, the state change, the interoception, the practices that emerge rather than get imposed, this is genuinely difficult to name. Researchers and practitioners working at this edge are still reaching for language that fits. And the language matters because the people this actually applies to tend to be 45 or 52 or 61. Not athletes. Not people who can restructure their schedules around biometric data and recovery protocols. People with real jobs, real fatigue, real history in the body, and still, somehow, a real appetite for more. What does optimization actually mean for that person? What does it look like when it's working? That question opens something this conversation hasn't fully entered yet, and it's worth entering carefully. There's a moment happening right now in men's health coverage that is worth naming directly, because you've probably seen it and felt something go slightly flat when you did. The headline version goes like this: 55-year-old reverses his biological age by 12 years. Cold plunges, continuous glucose monitor, 7 supplements before breakfast. The comments fill with men who say things like, incredible, just subscribe to his stack, and men who say nothing at all because they already know without being able to articulate why, that what they're looking at has nothing to do with their actual life. That gap between what's being sold and what's actually available to you is what this chapter is about. Because when the word Humanmaxxing first appeared in this video, we said it was being misread. We said it had been colonized by a particular type of person with a particular type of income and a particular obsession with self-optimization that most of us neither want nor can afford. And we said that for you, watching this at whatever age you are, in whatever condition your body is actually in right now, it meant something different. Here is what it actually means. Not as a concept, as a lived thing. Humanmaxxing, for someone in the second half of their life, is not about adding anything. It is about removing what is blocking what is already there. That frame changes everything. The longevity industry is built almost entirely around the language of addition. Take this, stack that, upgrade here. And the implicit message underneath all of it is that you are insufficient as you currently are, and that sufficiency requires purchase. That message is not neutral. It has weight, and people who have been receiving it for years, through supplements, through diagnostics, through the quiet shame of failing to maintain whatever routine they started in January, carry it in a specific place. Not in the stomach, in the shoulders, in the small muscles that hold the jaw slightly tighter than it needs to be, in the low current anxiety that attaches itself to any decision about the body, because every decision about the body has become a referendum on whether you are enough. Remove that frame and something starts to move. The body you have at 52 or 58 or 63 is not a depleted version of the body you had at 35. It is a different body with different capacities operating under a different logic. And that logic, when you stop fighting it, has a coherence that nothing in the optimization industry is actually selling you. There are people who have discovered this not in clinics, but in ordinary kitchens and backyards, at ordinary ages, with ordinary means. A woman named Carol, a retired school librarian from Akron, Ohio, not an athlete, not someone who had ever counted a macronutrient in her life, began sleeping differently at 54. Not a protocol, not a supplement. She moved the television out of her bedroom because she'd half read something once about blue light and couldn't sleep anyway. And she thought, what exactly do I have to lose? That's it. One piece of furniture wheeled down the hall on a Wednesday evening. The bedroom went quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. The kind of quiet that has a temperature to it, cool and still, the way a room feels when the hum you'd stopped noticing finally stops. She woke the next morning before her alarm, lay there in the dark listening to the neighborhood come awake, and felt something she later struggled to name. Not rested exactly, more like located. That feeling cascaded. The mornings became something she moved toward instead of through. She started walking, not because anyone told her to, but because being outside at 7 in the morning had become genuinely pleasant, and the walking was an extension of that pleasantness. 2 years later, her doctor reviewed blood work she'd assumed would be discouraging and asked what she'd changed. She thought about it for a moment. I moved the television, she said. That is not a transformation narrative. That is what the removal of one friction point looks like when the body is allowed to follow its own momentum. A man named Raymond, 61, who had worked in logistics in Memphis for 30 years, was forced into early retirement when his plant relocated. He spent 18 months in a state of low-grade purposelessness, Not depressed exactly, just running hot and going nowhere like an engine left in park. He started volunteering at a community garden. He'd never gardened. He chose it because it was the only option on the sign-up sheet that happened outside. What followed surprised everyone, including his cardiologist. Blood pressure down, inflammatory markers down, sleep measurably improved, weight redistributed without any deliberate dietary change. Raymond would show up on cold Memphis mornings when the soil smelled like iron and wet clay, and he would kneel in it for 2 hours, and something in his nervous system, which had been running on alert for 18 months, maybe longer, would gradually stop treating every hour as an emergency. His cardiologist described the results as statistically improbable for his age cohort. Raymond's explanation was simpler. I started having something to do before noon that wasn't my problem. What Raymond removed was purposelessness. What Carol removed was overstimulation. Neither of them thought of themselves as biohackers. But what they were doing, without the language, without the supplements, without the continuous glucose monitor, was working with the law of vibration in its most literal physical sense. The body is not a machine that processes inputs and produces outputs. It is a system that is constantly reading signal and calibrating to match. The signal Raymond was running for 18 months was threat. Low-level, chronic, invisible threat. And every system in his body, immune, metabolic, cardiovascular, was organized around that frequency. The garden didn't add anything to Raymond's body. It changed the signal his body was receiving and therefore the signal his body was producing. What the research on psychoneuroimmunology has been documenting for decades is essentially this. The body moves toward what the environment consistently tells it is true about the world. This is the mechanism the law of attraction points at when you strip away the wishful thinking. It is not about manifesting outcomes through positive thought. It is about the physiological reality that sustained internal states, sustained frequencies, reorganize biological function over time. Raymond's internal state shifted when he had dirt under his fingernails and something alive depending on him before noon. Carol's internal state shifted when the bedroom went dark and quiet, and the last thing she heard before sleep was not a television, but the sound of her own breathing. The body updated its picture of what was true. What connects these two stories is not willpower. It is not information, not discipline, not the acquisition of a health identity. It is the identification of a specific weight that had become invisible through familiarity and the decision, sometimes deliberate and sometimes almost accidental, to put it down. The immune system does not need to be told how to regulate inflammation. It already knows. What it needs is for the constant low-level emergency signal to quiet enough that it can do its job without interference. The sleep architecture does not need to be rebuilt from scratch. It needs the television out of the room and the last hour before bed relieved of the specific alertness that screens produce. The weight that redistributed itself in Raymond's body did not require a diet. It required the body to stop operating in a threat state, which changes how it metabolizes, how it stores, and where it holds tension. None of this is new science. What is more recently documented is how quickly these systems respond once the interference is removed. Not over years, often over weeks. Sometimes in people over 50 specifically, in days, because a nervous system that has been tuned by decades of real experience is in some ways more responsive to environmental signal than a younger one. Not less. The system is sensitive. It has been paying close attention for a long time. Give a cleaner signal and it moves fast. The optimization industry cannot sell this. There is no packaging for it, but it is the most precise intervention available to you. The story you are running in real time about what your body is capable of and what your life is still in the process of becoming. That story is vibrating at a frequency. The body is reading it. And because the body is reading it, the story is not merely psychological, it is biological. It is shaping immune function, hormonal output, sleep architecture, metabolic rate. The story is the intervention, which is why the most important question in this chapter is not what to add. It is what you're currently carrying that you picked up so long ago you've stopped noticing the weight. You already know what it is. You have probably known for a while. And when you put it down, not if, when you will not experience it as an upgrade. You will experience it as a recognition. Something landing in the right place after years of being slightly off. The direction will change. You will feel it before you can explain it. And that feeling, that shift in internal frequency, is the signal that the recalibration has already begun. There's a story that has been running in the background of everything lately. You may have a different version of it than the person sitting next to you, but the emotional signature tends to be the same, a low, persistent sense that something is slipping, that the systems we relied on, medical, political, social, are under more pressure than they can hold, and that the body, which was supposed to be the one thing you could manage directly, has started to feel less like an instrument and more like a negotiation. That's not a rhetorical setup. That's the actual news. The news this week, like most weeks now, carried another round of reports on what researchers are calling the long-term health consequences of pandemic-era disruption. Not just long COVID as a clinical category, but the downstream effects of 3+ years of elevated stress load on people who are already managing the ordinary deterioration of midlife. Reduced physical activity, disrupted sleep architecture, chronic low-grade inflammation markers elevated in populations that had no prior history of immune dysregulation. These are not fringe findings. They are appearing across peer-reviewed literature in sufficient volume that the phrasing has shifted from emerging concern to established pattern. And if you're somewhere in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, reading that, there's a very specific feeling. Not panic, worse than panic, a kind of dull confirmation. The sense that the thing you were already half expecting someone to say out loud has now been said out loud. And what you're left with is not fear so much as a narrowing, a quiet recalculation of what's still available. That recalculation is what this chapter is about. Because here's where the story branches, and where most reporting stops before it should. What those same researchers found, in the same data sets, sometimes in the same papers, is that the body's response to this kind of accumulated damage is not a closed file. It is a live system still taking input. Stay with that for a moment, because the mind will move past it quickly. It has learned to. There is a study out of the University of Copenhagen from 2020 that tracked adults between 60 and 78 who had no prior history of structured physical training. No base, no advantage, just ordinary people at the back end of the demographic range that most fitness culture stops marketing to. Over 12 weeks of resistance training. The satellite cells responsible for muscle repair, the ones the body uses to rebuild structural tissue, proliferated at rates the researchers described as comparable to those seen in adults 30 years younger. Not approximating, not encouraging given the circumstances. Comparable. The body did not receive the memo that it was supposed to have quit. Now here is where most people feel something happen in the chest. A small involuntary opening, and immediately shut it. Because they've been here before. They've heard the version of this story that ends in fine print. More research needed. Results may vary. And the opening closes, and they go back to managing the narrowing. But notice what happened when the opening occurred. Not what you thought about it. What happened physically. The shoulders, maybe. Something across the jaw. A holding pattern that had been running on automatic for some time, briefly interrupted. That release did not ask for your belief. It didn't require commitment. It happened because a specific quality of information arrived, not reassurance, not motivation, but precision, and the body responded to precision the way it responds to temperature, without deliberation. That involuntary release is not a small thing. That is the system demonstrating that it is still, right now, listening. This is what the accumulated research on stress and immune function has been pointing at for decades, most visibly in the work of Janice Kekol-Glaser at Ohio State, who spent her career documenting not the dramatic clinical cases, but the ordinary ones. Regular people, no diagnoses, just the routine pressure of living, and showing that the internal environment of a person alters the behavior of immune cells, inflammatory markers, wound healing rates. Measurably, repeatably, the body does not sort threats by category. It reads signal. A threat that lives in the mind arrives at the cell with the same authority as a threat in the room, which means the inverse is also true. And this is the part that most reporting omits because it doesn't fit cleanly into either the crisis frame or the wellness frame. The internal orientation a person carries about what is still possible, the age of that story, whether it has gone sour, whether it has room in it for new input. That orientation is arriving at the cellular level right now. Not as metaphor, as measurable biological input into a system that has not stopped reading. This is not an instruction to feel better. The system sees through performance. It reads below the surface, and it will not be fooled by manufactured optimism layered over a story that still believes the account is closed. What it responds to is ground. Solid, factual ground. The weight you've been carrying, the news this week, the accumulated years of hard recalibrations, the body that has been asking for something you haven't known how to give it. That weight is real. It was never pretend, but weight is not the same as wall. Weight is something a person can put down long enough to feel what's underneath. What's underneath is not recovery to a prior state. The decade when your knees were quieter is not the destination. That's a backwards-facing story, and the biology doesn't work that way. What the biology offers is forward-facing adaptation. Not to a younger version of yourself, but to the actual present configuration of cells and accumulated experience and surviving capacity that is here right now, in this body, on this day, after this particular week of news. The system is still taking input. That is not comfort. That is a structural fact about how living tissue works. And the stone that settled when you started carrying this week's weight, it's still there. It didn't dissolve, but it has changed character. It is no longer weight that arrived without context. It has a name now, a location, a relationship to something true and verifiable. And weight that has been honestly named stops being a stone at the bottom of still water. It becomes something you can orient around. You're oriented now, not toward a resolution, toward a direction. And direction is the one thing that is always available from exactly where you are standing. Not from where you used to stand, not from the year before the disruption, not from some future point where everything finally makes sense. From here, this body, this moment, this week's news carried honestly and set down carefully enough to feel what was underneath it. The system is listening. You just gave it something real to work with.
There's a specific kind of relief that doesn't announce itself as relief. It arrives quietly. In the middle of a sentence, someone else is speaking, or at the end of a long exhale you didn't know you were holding. You don't name it when it happens. You just notice, distantly, that something that was braced has released. And then the next thought comes, and the moment passes, and you wonder if you imagined it. That is what this chapter is about. 3 weeks ago, a study published in a nature-affiliated journal tracked cortisol patterns in adults across 14 countries during a single week of elevated geopolitical news coverage. Not a crisis week, just an ordinary week of the kind of low-grade ambient alarm that has become the background hum of the current decade. The finding that landed hardest wasn't about cortisol levels themselves. It was about lag time, the stress response, the physiological activation, persisted an average of 6 hours after the participants had stopped consuming the news. Not 6 minutes, 6 hours. The content was gone. The body was still processing the threat, and the participants in their self-reports described feeling fine, functional, normal, unaware that anything was still running underneath. That gap between what the body is doing and what the mind believes is happening is where this chapter lies. Because this is the morning after all of that. The actual morning. The one where you wake up and the world is still the same world. The same headlines assembling themselves somewhere out there. The same ambient noise of a civilization straining against itself. And you have to decide before coffee, before language, before the phone lights up with its first small urgency. Where do I put my weight today? That's the question the whole conversation has been circling. And what emerged, not as a lesson, not as a prescription, but as something closer to a recovered instinct, is this: you don't need to solve the world before you can move through it cleanly. You never did. Here is where that lands concretely. The first thing is so simple, it will feel like it couldn't possibly be enough. In the first 7 minutes after waking, before any input enters, before news, before the phone, before the full shape of the day organizes itself in your mind, you let the body speak first, not by meditating, not by journaling, not by following any format, just by noticing what state you're already in. Is there tightness across the upper chest, the particular kind that sits just below the collarbone? Not quite pain, more like a door held shut, a low resistance in the legs, like moving through slightly thicker air, a heaviness behind the eyes that isn't tiredness but something more like accumulated gravity, the weight of hours still owed to yesterday. You don't fix it. You don't reframe it. You don't tell yourself it's a good day. You clock it. The way a navigator takes a reading not to panic at the coordinates, but to know where the vessel actually is before plotting anything. That reading, taken honestly, is itself a form of interruption. Because the moment you observe your own state without immediately trying to escape it, you've broken the automatic loop. The loop that runs from dread to contraction, to bracing to posture to breathe to mood to decision. All before breakfast, all below the level of conscious choice. One moment of clean observation, and the loop has a gap in it. That gap is not nothing. The study's authors noted something similar in their methodology, almost incidentally. Participants who were asked to log their physical sensations in the morning, not their feelings, not their thoughts, just the raw somatic data, showed significantly compressed lag times by the end of the week. The 6-hour tail shortened, not because they'd changed what they consumed, because they'd changed the first conversation of the day. Instead of immediately letting the world narrate their interior, they took the reading themselves. That is the first permission, not a task. A permission to check in before the world checks in on you. The second thing moves outward, sometime in the morning, not in a special place, not in a structured ritual. Find one physical sensation you can genuinely stay with, not perform appreciation for, but actually feel. The temperature of water meeting your hands at the sink, the specific cold of it before it warms, the weight of a mug held in both palms, the heat moving through ceramic into the web between thumb and forefinger, the quality of early light through a particular window, the way it sits flat on a wooden surface and goes slightly amber at the edge, something that is actually here, actually present, actually carrying no threat in it at all. Hold attention there longer than feels necessary, longer than the mind thinks is useful, because what you're doing is providing the sensory system with evidence, not reassurance, evidence that the present moment is not an emergency. The nervous system treats the absence of danger as meaningful data, not merely the absence of data. When you linger physically in something benign and real, you are submitting a report from the field. The field says safe. Not permanently, not naively. Safe in this moment, at this temperature, with this weight in your hands. And this moment is the only time calibration can actually happen. These two things, the morning observation, the sensory anchor, are not steps toward something more elaborate. They are the practice, small enough to do on the worst day, precise enough to actually work. Because what the study pointed toward, and what the research on interoception has been building toward for a decade, is that the nervous system does not distinguish cleanly between a threat that is happening and a threat that is being narrated. It responds to the story you are in. Heart rate variability, inflammatory markers, sleep architecture, decision quality in the hours that follow, all of it shifts when the first data point of the day changes. Not through force of will, not through positive thinking, through the quiet, repeated practice of honest observation and sensory presence. You don't need to believe any of that for it to work. The mechanism doesn't require faith. It requires only consistency and a willingness to stop treating the first moments of the day as dead time to be filled with incoming information. So here is what this chapter is actually offering. Not a 10-step system, not a morning routine that looks impressive in golden light. 2 small points of entry, available tomorrow, regardless of what arrives when the phone wakes up. Observe before you absorb. Find something real and stay there a moment longer than feels justified. That's the door. And now, before this conversation closes, there is one more thing worth naming. A question that has been sitting quietly in the background of every chapter, never quite asked directly. Something about why this channel exists the way it does. Why the news is here at all, alongside everything else. Why this specific shape for a conversation about transformation. The question isn't about format. It's about something more fundamental. The difference between a place that promises to change how you see the world and a place that actually does it. Between telling you that your inner state matters and doing something, in the structure of the video itself, in the pacing, in the silences between sentences, that creates the proof of that in real time. That distinction, that difference, that's what the final chapter is for. You already know the feeling. It's not one thing. It's the weight that sits in your chest before you've even finished reading the headline. The slight bracing in your shoulders when you open the app. The way your jaw tightens without your permission. You've been carrying that today. Maybe for longer than today. And you came into this video with it already on you. Not because you're weak, not because you're catastrophizing, but because the thing we reported at the start of this chapter was real, and your body knows real when it encounters it. Stay with that for a moment. Don't rush past it. Here is what actually happened in the world this week, and why it mattered enough to bring you here. The reports came out of 3 separate cities within 48 hours of each other. The kind of timing that doesn't feel like coincidence, even when analysts insist it is. In each case, the pattern was the same. An institution that people had organized their trust around, quietly, over decades, revealed itself to be operating under a logic that had nothing to do with the people inside it. Not dramatically, not with a villain and a press conference, just the slow, fluorescent-lit revelation that the thing you'd placed some portion of your stability in had been making decisions in a language you were never meant to understand. The smell of it is specific. If you've ever sat in a waiting room while someone behind a desk decides something about your life, you know the smell. Slightly too cold. The hum of a machine somewhere you can't see. The particular exhaustion of waiting for information that is already decided. That happened. We're not going to pretend it didn't, or soften the edges of what it means. Because the real story isn't just the event. It's that this event landed on people who were already carrying the weight of the last event, and the one before that. That's the journalism that doesn't make it into the summary at the top of the hour. Not just what happened, what it costs, biologically and otherwise, to be a person who keeps paying attention. And here is where something shifts, not because we're pivoting away from the difficulty, but because the difficulty itself changes shape when you move through it rather than just absorb it. There's a man in the UX study cohort, not named, represented only by his data, whose inflammatory markers were tracked over a period of 4 years. He worked in financial services during 2 cycles of severe market instability. He slept on paper enough hours. He exercised. He didn't drink heavily. And still, over those 4 years, his biological age outpaced his chronological age by nearly a decade. The researchers weren't looking at what news he consumed. They were looking at what state he was in when he consumed it, whether he had anywhere to put it, whether the activation had somewhere to resolve, or whether it just stayed low-grade, persistent, invisible, like a sound you stop hearing. But that never actually stops. What you're doing right now, staying with the weight of this instead of clicking away from it, choosing to move through the actual texture of what happened in the world this week, instead of collecting a headline and carrying it unexamined, that is not a small thing. Your nervous system is doing something different right now than it does when you scroll. The difference is not dramatic. It won't feel like a breakthrough, but it is measurable, and it is cumulative, and it is the entire reason this channel is built the way it is. Not optimism, not distance, not the warm light of someone telling you things are going to be fine, when you can feel in your sternum that the situation is genuinely complicated and genuinely serious. Just a different place to stand when the weight arrives, grounded enough that it moves through you instead of staying. The event this week asked something hard. The institution's logic was not benign. The people affected are real, living in apartments with specific dimensions and sounds outside specific windows, trying to make decisions with information they were not given and were not meant to have. That deserves to be said plainly, held plainly, without flinching and without spiraling. You held it. If you're watching this and something in your chest is slightly different than it was 40 minutes ago, not lighter exactly, but distributed differently, the way a bag shifts when you adjust the strap, then you already know what this practice does. It doesn't remove the news. The news is going to keep arriving, heavy and specific and real, on a frequency that doesn't pause for recovery. What changes is where you are standing when it gets there. That place is in you. It is built slowly, the way the body builds anything that lasts, not in a single session, but in the accumulation of sessions. The way a cold room gradually warms when the heat has been on long enough. You don't feel it happening. Then one morning you wake up, and the floor under your feet is not cold anymore. Subscribe if what you felt here tonight is something you want to keep building. Not because this channel requires an audience to believe in what it's doing, it does. But that's not the reason. Subscribe because the world is not going to slow down, and the thing that changes is not the world. And because you've already proven in this last hour that you can hold something real without being destroyed by it. That's not nothing. That's almost everything. There's something happening in your body right now that you probably haven't named yet. Not excitement exactly. Not skepticism. You moved past that somewhere in the middle, something closer to the specific discomfort of recognizing that the argument you've been having with yourself for a long time is not actually the argument you thought it was. That's where we are. So let me tell you what I didn't finish saying. The story that keeps most people from moving isn't a story about failure. It isn't even a story about fear. Not really. It's a story about timing, precise, detailed load bearing. It says, The window was open. You didn't go through it, the window closed. The story has furniture. It has a smell. It has been told so many times inside the same skull that it no longer announces itself as a story. It arrives as weather, as fact, as the particular heaviness that settles in when you think about certain things too long. The story is wrong. Not wrong in the way someone tells you on a stage with a headset and a slide deck. Wrong in the structural sense, the architectural sense. The kind of wrong that doesn't ask for more effort or more belief or more urgency. It asks for orientation. A map reads slowly. A sign consulted for the first time instead of walked past. Here is what changed in the last several years of research into biological age, cellular signaling, and the body's responsiveness to expectation. The timeline the story uses as its evidence stopped holding. The work coming out of Horvath's lab, the longevity data from the NIA's interventional cohorts, the consistent finding that biological recalibration can be initiated at ages and stages the prior consensus had quietly written off. None of that is fringe. It is running in peer-reviewed journals. It was reported this year. It lands directly on the story's central claim, which is that certain departures have expiration dates, and it says, with clinical patience, you have been reading the wrong board. This is the actual news, the actual anchor, not a metaphor, a finding, a documented, replicated, currently active revision to what medicine thought it knew about when the body stops listening. You're not late. You're on the wrong platform. Those two diagnoses look similar from a distance and require entirely opposite responses. Late means run, compress, sacrifice precision for speed, treat every hour as cost. Wrong platform means something that takes longer to accept because it's quieter. It means stop. Read the board again. The train is running. It stops somewhere else. I want to be precise about what this video has been underneath its surface. It was not a lecture on supplementation or an argument about protocols. Those exist. They are real, they are documented, and they'll keep developing regardless of what tomorrow's coverage decides to emphasize or dismiss. What this video was, underneath the data and the case studies and the clinical language, was an attempt to change where you're standing. Not what you believe, not what you plan to implement, where you stand. Because the same information, absorbed from a position of structural misorientation, doesn't move you. It becomes more weight, more evidence cataloged from a platform where no train stops. Knowledge understood from the wrong place is just a heavier version of staying still. So this is where it ends. Not with a protocol. Not with the thing that happened to the man holding the photograph. That image has done its work, and repeating it now would be asking more of it than any metaphor can hold. What's left is something smaller and more persistent. A question that won't close before the end of the evening. The kind that follows you into the car, and into the quiet after the house goes still, and into the moment just before sleep when everything accumulated finally settles, and what's left is only what's true. Something moved during this video. Maybe once, maybe several times. A moment where the information crossed a line and became specifically concretely about you rather than about the subject. You felt it as a shift in attention, a small tightening, a recognition you couldn't quite complete. That's not an accident, and it's not a technique. It's what happens when a documented finding intersects with a story you've been using as a fact without ever examining its foundations. The story has foundations. They can be examined. The question this video leaves you with isn't abstract, and it isn't cosmological. It's the same question the data points toward, stripped of its clinical language and returned to the scale of an actual life. What is the specific story you have been using to explain this particular stillness? Not stillness in general, this one, yours, and did you choose it? Or did it simply accumulate until it had enough furniture to feel permanent? That's where you're standing. The train is still running.